My name is Paul Woolever. I'm the owner of Pinellas Power Products, and this is the installation instruction video for my extended runtime fuel kit for generators that run the 145cc Chengjing Goyo Technologies Group engine. That would include the MaxpeedingRod MXR4000GT, which is what I will be shooting this video on. This fuel kit will work on any engines running the dual fuel version of the Chengjing Goyo 145cc engine. Real quickly, before we get going, if you have any more questions or anything like that about this, please look in the description section of this video and you will see a contact to get in touch with me by my website. And you can email me at paul@pinellaspowerproducts.com, or you can call me at the phone number listed on the website. There is a page on my website with a tremendous library of information about this kit. If you don't see the answer to your question either there or in the FAQ page, please go ahead and contact me, but do it through my website. Do not attempt to contact me through YouTube. I do not monitor the YouTube comments, so I do not reply to them. If you've got a question that requires a response, please contact me through my website. If you have a relevant comment on this video, please go ahead and leave it in the comments section. With that, let's go ahead and get started. So the first step in the installation process will be to remove the cabinet. So on the recoil side, the first thing we'll do is make sure that the fuel selector valve is in the off position and then remove the knob. And go ahead and set this off the side. There is a small silver screw that holds it on. And then you'll remove this side cover by removing two Phillips head screws. Now the two Phillips head screws that go on this side and on the other side are shorter than the Phillips head screws that are in the handle area. Then just take a flat blade screwdriver and some fingernails and go ahead and undo the snaps. I'm going to pull the recoil rope out just a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and lock it out, and we're just going to let this cover hang down so that it's out of the way. This side cover is removed the same way. It's held on by two Phillips head screws. You remove the two Phillips head screws, and they are short, just like the other side. And then we'll undo the spark plug cover, and we're just going to let that hang off the side. This cover unsnaps also, but this one we're going to lift it completely off and out of the way and set it off to the side. Okay, the front panel on the generator is held in place by four Phillips head screws. You've got one at either side toward the top, and then two more going straight in at the bottom. Now these four screws are longer than the ones that held the side covers on. These look like this. And I'll put one of the side cover screws up so you can see how much shorter they are. We'll go ahead and pull our little screws out of here. Okay, now to get the front cover off, if you take a flathead screwdriver and just pry up a little bit right here on this corner and ease it forward just the slightest bit, and you'll notice that that corner stays high. Then come around here and pry up just a little bit here and ease it forward so that this stays high. Now there are two more latches. One is right here and one is right here. So we'll do this one first. We'll slide the screwdriver under it and pry up just a little bit. And there it went. And now there's another one over here, and we'll pry up on that. And now the cover has snapped loose. So this side of the cover is going to come forward farther than this side, and that's fine. Now we're going to take off the rear cover. The rear cover is held on by 6 Phillips head screws. And these 6 Phillips head screws are longer also. Now we can lift this cover off and set it to the side. Okay, the next step is to go ahead and take this side of the housing off. And to do that, there are 4 Phillips head screws in the handle and then 3 bolts down low. So we'll go ahead and take our 4 Phillips head screws out. And these are the long ones, just like held the front cover. And now we'll take out the 3 bottom bolts. The bolts are a shouldered bolt. And now we'll ease this cover back. You'll notice there's a decal right here that goes across the 2 sides. You'll have to razor cut the decal right down the center as opposed to trying to pull it off. And now we can slide this side back out of the way, and that's going to give us room to remove the valve cover. This is the valve cover, and it's held on with 4 bolts, 1 at each corner. So the first step is going to be to disconnect this hose, which is the breather hose, and it runs from the valve cover over to the intake runner right here. So now we're going to go ahead and remove the breather hose. So we're just going to take a pair of pliers and slide it off of the barb on the valve cover, and then pull it loose from the fitting on the intake manifold. There is a small elbow fitting that plugs into the intake manifold, and we'll pull that off with the hose. So the whole hose comes out this direction. The place where it plugs into the intake manifold is hidden right behind the propane line. You can see it right here when I put my finger on it. This hose here is the propane line. So now what we're going to do is go ahead and remove these 4 bolts that hold the valve cover into place. The upper left-hand corner valve cover bolt also has a ground strap. So make sure when you're putting it together, this wire here with the ring terminal goes to the upper left-hand corner of the valve cover. The valve cover is held on with 4 of these bolts with an 8mm head on them. So when you get the valve cover bolts removed, go ahead and lift your valve cover off. What we're going to do is we're going to remove the stock PCV valve. So let's go over to the workbench and get started on that. Okay, the PCV valve is held in place by 4 very small Phillips head screws. So we're going to pull these 4 Phillips head screws out. Okay, once you get all 4 screws out, just tip the valve cover upside down and you take the breather plate out. On the breather plate there's a PCV valve, and that is this really thin wafer right here. If I can get a fingernail or something under it to push up on this wafer so you can see it. There you go. I'll push the needle nose pliers through the hole so you can see where it's coming through. What we're going to do is we're going to use a zip tie to zip tie the reed valve open against the reed valve stop. That way the reed valve is open the whole time now. The kit includes a new PCV valve that will be installed external to the engine later on. There's 2 methods of disabling the PCV valve, or excuse me, 2 methods of disabling the stock PCV valve. One is with a zip tie like I'm doing here. The other is just reach in with a pair of needle nose pliers and rip the original valve out of there, since it will no longer be used. I'm going to go ahead and do it this way, simply to show how it's done. It is a little bit more difficult to do, but I have now zip tied the PCV valve in the open position, and again you can see that it is zip tied open. If you wanted to, you could reach in there with a piece of or pair of needle nose pliers and just mutilate that valve so it would never be able to function again, which that's another option. Okay, so now we've got the stock PCV valve disabled, we're going to go ahead and put the breather plate back in place. And it goes right back in place, right where it came out of. And then you'll put the 4 screws back in place as well. And I'm going to put them all in loose, and once they're all started, I'll go back and start tightening them up. I'd like to take a minute here to discuss the gaskets. This is the valve cover gasket right here. If you tear your valve cover gasket, the kit will include a tube of Permatex RTV black gasket sealer. You'll remember that there was a gasket underneath the breather plate. If you choose to put gasket sealer on that, which I don't recommend, because as you'll notice, the whole side, or both sides, are covered in oil. It's not a gasket that serves a function to keep oil out. It's simply a damper between the steel breather cover and the aluminum valve cover. If you choose to put gasket sealer on that one, do not cover this little bitty weep hole right here. If you cover that little bitty weep hole, your generator's not going to run correctly. What that's for is a certain amount of oil and air is going to be blown through this hole. That is an oil recovery line, and if it's plugged up, then you're going to be blowing oil and air out through the breather line, which will then clog up the pulse port on the fuel pump and fill the intake manifold full of oil, things like that. So whatever you do, don't clog that hole with gasket sealant. I'm just double checking these screws, make sure that they're in nice and snug. And then we will go ahead and bolt this back on our engine. This is the cylinder head where the valve cover will be reinstalled. You can see the ground lead wire hanging loose at the top. Inspect the valve surface, or the gasket surface, to make sure that there are no tears in the gasket or pieces of gasket laying on there. If they are, they'll need to be addressed, and at that point you'll need to use the black RTV silicone gasket sealant that's included in the kit. So now we're going to go ahead and put our valve cover gasket back in place. And it goes on just the opposite of the way it came off. I'm going to put the bottom 2 screws first, then the top right one, and then the last screw I put in will be the top left, which also gets a ground strap put on over the screw. What I do is I put all the screws in at first, and then I go ahead and snug them down. You'll notice that the ground strap right here heads up so that it does not get in the way of the choke assembly. Okay, now that we have the valve cover back in place, what we need to do is come around to the other side of the generator and disconnect the fuel hose from the back of the fuel selector valve. This hose right here that I'm pointing to with the screwdriver is the hose that takes the fuel from the fuel selector valve to the carburetor. So we're going to undo the Corbin clamp right here and then slide the hose off the back of the fuel selector valve. First thing you'll do is double check to make sure that the fuel selector valve is in the off position, and ours is. I'm going to go ahead and remove the Corbin clamp and the hose, and then I will show you how the Corbin clamps work when I get it out of here so you can actually see it. Okay, this is a Corbin clamp, and what happens is you squeeze on the tabs of the Corbin clamp with a pair of pliers, and that opens the clamp up. So right now the clamp is open, and if we release, you'll see that the clamp tightens down the portion that's around the hose. We squeeze on them and that opens it up. So that's how a Corbin clamp works. And now what we'll do is we'll go back around to the other side of the generator and we'll remove the other end of this hose, which is connected to the carburetor itself. So this is the carburetor assembly, and what we're going to do is we're going to remove this hose right here, which is the hose that used to connect to the fuel selector valve. I don't know if we've got enough light on it to see it, but it's this one right down here with the Corbin clamp on it. What we're going to do is we're going to remove this hose right here, and that's the opposite end of the hose that we just removed from the fuel selector valve. And it has a Corbin clamp on it just like the other end did. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove this end of it and slide it out the other side of the generator. Okay, so here's the hose that we just removed. You notice that this end, the end that used to go to the carburetor, has a Corbin clamp on it, just like the end that used to go to the fuel selector valve. So we're going to go ahead and set this hose off to the side. We will not be reusing it. Okay, included in our kit is a section of 3/16 hose. That would be the smaller size hose. The other section is 1/4 inch. But this is about 12 inches long. And what we're going to do is we're going to feed it under the propane hose and then along the bottom of the fuel tank here and slide it onto the fuel selector valve right where the original hose went onto the fuel selector valve. So now if you'll see the hose barb on the back of the fuel selector valve, it's what I'm touching with my finger, I'm going to reach in with a pair of needle nose pliers and I'm going to slide the hose that we just put into place, the 3/16 hose, I'm going to slide it onto this hose barb. Okay, so now you can see the hose is in place, and what we're going to do is take a small hose clamp included in the kit and slide it onto that hose and clamp it down nice and tight. Let me take a moment to show you exactly how the hose clamps included in the kit work. Here's one of the hose clamps, and to crimp it down, you squeeze the two sides together with a pair of pliers, like so. If they don't line up just right when you squeeze them on, you can squeeze from side to side like this to line them up. If you want to undo the hose clamp, grab one side and rock sideways with the other side. These hose clamps are completely reusable. There are certain locations where we're going to be using zip ties because it is so tight for space. The advantage of the hose clamp is it's reusable. The zip ties are a one-shot deal. So once you put a zip tie on it, you have to cut it to get it off. Now we'll go over to the other side of the generator again. So this is our 3/16 hose that we just got through connecting the other end to the fuel selector valve. If you remember, this is the original breather line that we removed. It used to go from the valve cover into the intake manifold in this little port down here. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut 1.5 inches off of this end of our breather tube. You'll notice it is a formed hose, and that's why we've got to cut it off of this end. Like I say, it's going to be 1.5 inches that we cut off. If you make it a little bit too long, because you can always shorten it. But once you cut it too short, you can't lengthen it. So we're going to cut it 1.5 inches long. Like so. So this 1.5 inch piece will now go onto the valve cover right where it went originally. Then included in the kit, there's a reducer to go from 3/8 to 1/4 inch. That is going to go into the original stock breather hose. It goes in a lot easier if you put just a little bit of oil on this fitting because it's very tight. So if we open up the oil fill cap, we can use the dipstick to put just a little bit of oil on our fitting. And don't forget to screw that dipstick back in again. So now we've got our reducer. The 3/8 inch end is inside this hose. The 1/4 inch end is sticking out. So what we're going to do now is we're going to put 2 zip ties in place. And you'll see why when we go to put that cabinet back on. It's just too tight an area to attempt to use the hose clamps. So here's where we're going to use the zip ties. So you stretch one of the zip ties on nice and snug, and then clip the tail off. Then we go to this location. We put a zip tie on it, and we pull it down nice and snug, and we clip the tail off. You may be wondering, it didn't have clamps or zip ties in the stock configuration, and that's because stock, it was simply a way of redirecting the blow-by gases into the intake. We are going to harness the pressure wave to power the fuel pump, so we don't want any leaks in the system. Included in the kit, there's a section of 1/4 inch hose about 6 feet long. We're going to take a section 3.5 inches long. We'll cut it 3.5 inches long. And that's going to go onto this fitting. Now remember, this can be trimmed later on. I'm cutting it 3.5 because that way we can always shorten it if we need to, but we can't lengthen it. So now you have the section of original factory hose, 1.5 inch section, the reducer, and a 3.5 inch section of our 1/4 inch hose. If you remember on the carburetor where we disconnected this end of the hose, what we're going to do is we are going to cut a section of the 1/4 inch hose that's included in the kit. We're going to cut it 11.5 inches long. And we're going to put that onto the carburetor on the fuel port where we removed this hose from originally. If you look down from the top, you can get a better view of what you're trying to look at. But you want to make sure that that hose is slid all the way onto that hose barb. Okay, now that we have the hose onto the hose barb, I'm going to take another zip tie, because again, that's a very tight area in there. Pull it down fairly snug, then slide it all the way up over the hose where it goes onto the hose barb. And I'm going to take a pair of pliers, I'm going to pull some tension on it, and then I'll cut the tail off of that. Okay. The reason we had to use the zip tie instead of the hose clamp is because this is probably the most difficult location to get one of those hose clamps into, and it is definitely a tight fit. You notice that the hoses included in my kit are a much thicker wall than the ones that are stock. I like to use the Gates Barricade hose just to make sure that it doesn't rub through on anything. Okay, now it's time to start putting the cabinet back together. First things first is during the disassembly process, this little piece of rubber fell off of this tab on the fuel tank. So you'll want to put that back in place. There is one on the other side too. I'm just going to double check real quickly to make sure it didn't fall out, and it did not. The other side housing we leave in place, which helps a lot. Okay, so now we've got the new breather hose, the new fuel line coming from the stock fuel tank, and the new fuel line going to the carburetor. So we want those to all poke out this hole in the cabinet when we put this portion of the cabinet back together. And this will slide back in exactly where it came out of. And you'll need to lift up and push and tuck to get everything in place just right. So I've got the bottom in place, so what I'm going to do is put the 3 shoulder bolts I'll start with the center bolt. And I'm not going to tighten them all the way down. Now I'm going to take my flashlight and make sure that I've got no wires pinched and no hoses out of place. There are 2 clear hoses that attach the carburetor, and there are little recesses in the bottom of the cabinet that they snap into. Okay, now I'm going to put my 4 screws into the handle. And we're just going to put those in loose for now too. And I'm going to go back and snug them down. Make sure that there's nothing sticking through here where it should not be. And then we'll snug down these 3 bottom shoulder bolts. This generator is pretty compact, and there's an awful lot of stuff in a very small space. And by the time we're done with it, there's going to be even more stuff in an even smaller, or excuse me, even more stuff in that small space. Okay, so now we can go and put our back cover in place. What we're going to do is we're going to put our back cover in place, and that uses the same 6 screws that it used originally. There are 2 tabs at the top that need to be slid into place, and there's 1 tab at the bottom that needs to go, 1 tab inside and 1 tab outside of the original housing. So we have to bow the cover just slightly to get the whole thing to go together. And there we go. And now we start putting our screws in. We'll put all 6 screws in at first, and then we'll come back and snug down all the screws. that's it for the back cover. Now for the front cover, we go ahead and slide it in, and we push the top of it in first to snap those latches that we had to pry out on the removal. And if you listened, you heard them snap into place. The bottom, I'm going to put these two screws in first, and then these two screws in after that. Okay, so that gets the front cover in place. Now we get to go ahead and put our fuel pump in. This is the hose that runs to the fuel inlet port of the carburetor. What I'm doing is I'm going to run it underneath this factory hose right here. So you'll notice it goes underneath the factory hose, and then it tucks behind this panel. There are two clear hoses that run down. The two clear hoses are behind this, so this goes between the clear hoses and this panel. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put the fuel filter into this hose, and remember that the arrows on the fuel filter indicate the direction of fuel flow, which is obviously to the carburetor. Okay. Then we're going to take our original 1/4-inch hose that was included in the kit, and we're going to cut ourselves a 5-inch section that'll go onto here. As I said earlier, I'm cutting these sections just a little longer than they need to be so that we can always shorten them later. So as you can see, with the 5-inch section, it sticks out quite a bit. Now, this is the fuel hose that goes to the fuel selector valve. And if you noticed, on our original fuel hose, this is 3/16 and this is 1/4 inch. So we need to use an adapter to go from 3/16 to 1/4 inch. So since this hose here was 3/16 that we put onto our original fuel selector valve, we're going to put the 3/16 end of the adapter into this hose here. It helps to have just a little bit of oil to dip these fittings into, to slide these hoses together, because at this point they start getting a little difficult. So this is going to slide behind this panel also. It is going to go above the stock hose, where the other fuel line that goes to the carburetor goes below the stock hose. And once again, there are two clear hoses that run up and down. They go behind this hose. So this hose goes between those other two clear hoses and this black plastic panel. Now I'm going to take another section of hose, again 5 inches long, and put it onto this 1/4 inch hose barb. So now we're going to work on the pulse line for the fuel pump. You'll need to cut 2 1.5 inch sections of the 1/4 inch hose from the section of 1/4 inch hose included in the kit. Okay, included in the kit, there's a 90-degree elbow. This 90-degree fitting is going to go into the end of this, and I want it to be able to tuck behind the propane line. So I'm going to dip the end of it in the oil so it slides together easier. Then take one of my 1.5 inch long hoses, dip this into the oil so it slides together fairly easy. I'm going to take this and tuck it behind this propane line. Then there's a T-fitting included in the kit. I'm going to dip one of the portions of the T-fitting into the oil again and slide it up into this 1.5 inch section of hose. Then there's one more section of 1.5 inch section of hose that I just cut earlier. And you'll see the T that goes back toward the carburetor. I'm going to dip that in the oil so that this section of hose goes on easily. What we're doing, if you remember, this was the original section of the breather hose, and it had a 90-degree fitting on the bottom of it that plugged into the intake manifold. Now, the new PCV valve is going to go into the intake manifold. You'll notice that this side of it is flat, and this side of it is slightly beveled. If you have any questions, blow through it. You should be able to blow through it in one direction, but not in the other direction. You should be able to blow in this end and air come out that way, but none blowing in this way, and that's the way it'll be oriented. This barb is going to go into the port on the intake manifold that this used to go in on the original generator when you removed the breather hose, the one that you cut 1.5 inches off of this end of it. So we're going to push this into this port on the intake manifold, right here. If you wanted to, purely for aesthetics, we can undo this and shave about 1/8 of an inch off of this hose. Okay, so I've trimmed a little bit off of this, and now we'll put it back in place. It really doesn't matter because this is going to be covered, but if you like to see things in a nice straight line, then you could shorten up that hose. Don't shorten it up too much because then it won't go over the fittings. But you plug it back in now, and now this is a straight vertical line. Like I said, it's not going to matter in reality because this cover, or this area is covered when you put the cabinet back together. Okay, so now it's time to go ahead and install the fuel pump. When you get the fuel pump, it's going to have covers on the fuel output and the fuel in lines. The one that does not have a cover is the pulse line. Make sure you remove the covers. So this hose with the fuel filter is in the output line of the fuel pump. The fuel pump is going to be sitting right down here. So you'll trim this hose the appropriate length to where it's got just a nice gentle bend coming up to here. So I'm going to trim the hose right here. And note the gold screen, that's going to face away from you. The pump will go in oriented like this. The pump will not be bolted in place. It's going to be held suspended by the hoses themselves. Okay, that looks like that'll work nicely. Going to put just a little bit of oil on this port so we can get that hose together. We'll just make sure that the fuel pump sits down in there nicely. Okay. Now what we're going to do is run our pulse line, and that'll go from this T-fitting by the PCV valve to the pulse port on the fuel pump. So what I'll do is I'll take the section of 1/4 inch hose and slide it onto the T-fitting. Then I'll take this end of it and feed it behind this plastic casing. Okay. What we want to do is make sure that there are no sharp bends in the pulse line. So mark it. Go ahead and cut the remainder of the hose off. This will go onto the pulse line for the fuel pump, or the pulse port of the fuel pump. Which is this hose barb when viewed from this direction. And actually, I don't like that. It's just a little bit too long. So let me pull that out and trim it off. Take about 3/8 of an inch off of it and try it again. Okay, that's a nice smooth routing now. Remember, the hose with the adapter to go from 1/4 to 3/16 is the one that's connected to the stock fuel tank. So now we're going to run the input hose. So we need to take a section of this hose and trim it 3 1/4 inches long. And what we're going to do, put just a little bit of oil on that and put it on the input port of the fuel pump. And I want this line to come in right about here. So I'm going to trim this one Yeah, the one that I just cut, I'm going to trim it about 1 inch shorter. And the reason I do it this way is because if you cut it too long, you can always shorten it. But if you cut it too short, it's a pain in the neck to cut a new piece of hose. So I do advise you to originally cut them the length that I mentioned. You can always trim them shorter. So now we're going to take the other T-fitting that's included in the kit, and it's going to be oriented like this. So this portion will go into that short section of hose we originally cut, I believe 3.5 inches long. This is our hose that goes to the stock fuel tank. So I'm going to shorten this by about 3/4 of an inch. Okay. Our remainder of hose, we have plenty left, way more than we need. I'm going to feed down through the spark plug access hole, and it'll go onto the remaining port of the T-fitting. Okay. So then we want to check all of our hoses and make sure that none are pinched or kinked or anything like that. At this point, I want to go over it because everything is nicely routed. This is the original stock propane hose, and it has not been moved. This hose right back here with the cover over it is also stock. So you're going to take the hose that runs from the fuel selector valve, which is this one right here. It goes behind the propane hose and above this other hose that is in a jacket. Then it runs behind this bracket into the T-fitting. The pulse line is hooked to the valve cover where the original breather hose was, comes over, then down, then there's a T-fitting right here. Let me pull this out of the way a little bit so you can see. There's the new PCV valve, and then it goes into the intake manifold. From the T-fitting down, nice gentle arch and into the fuel pump. Then the input line, you're going to have one to the fuel fitting from the remote tank. That goes down to the T, where the fitting from the original stock tank goes to. And then this is the fuel output. Goes from the fuel pump through the fuel filter up here behind all these hoses, and then hooks into the carburetor on that port that I had mentioned earlier is so difficult to get at. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put the clamps in place. On the breather or pulse line, I'm going to use the zip ties. You can either use zip ties or the hose clamps. I like the zip ties because they're a lower profile, and this is not a commonly serviced item. I'm going to take just a minute and make sure that the oil fill cap is tightened down. I like using the hose clamps on the fuel pump and on the fuel filter. The fuel filter, obviously, it's a serviceable item, and the fuel pump, if you're doing any troubleshooting or fine-tuning or anything like that later, you may need to connect and disconnect. So I don't really recommend the fuel pump using the zip ties. I'd rather see you use the clamps on that because you can reuse the clamps as many times as you want, where the zip ties, once you put them on, you have to cut them to get them off. The pulse line here does not carry gasoline, it carries air. But it is critical that you do not have any leaks, because this engine is so small that even the slightest air leak will cause it to reduce the efficiency of the fuel transfer pump. Truth be known, this elbow fitting up here has plenty of room around it, so you could use the hose clamps if you wanted, but the zip ties are just a much lower profile and they fit into tight areas like that much better. And what I'm doing is I'm just going through every single hose connection now and putting my clamps on it now that I got the hoses cut to length and put into place. You'll need clamps on every single hose up to the PCV valve. Where the PCV valve plugs into the manifold, number one, there's no way to put a clamp on there. There wasn't one there factory. But number two, after the PCV valve, all it is a vent line. Up until the PCV valve, it has pressure and vacuum alternating. Where it plugs into the manifold is just in case there's any blow-by gases. It's then run back into the carburetor, and that's strictly for emissions purposes. You could leave the PCV valve hanging loose. It wouldn't pass emissions, and it would make an odd, kind of a whooshing sound from the motor. So that's why I go ahead and put it back to the original position there. Okay, so now all these are clamped up. We've got the adapter from the 3/16 to quarter, and I'm going to go ahead and put hose clamps on that. So on the 1/4 inch side, I'll have a large hose clamp, and on the small side, the 3/16 side, we'll be putting a small hose clamp. And the kit has enough hose clamps to put hose clamps in a lot of the positions that I choose to put a zip tie in, because the zip ties are just a whole lot easier to fit in such a small, cramped-in area. Okay, our final hose is the one that goes from the top of this T-fitting and routes up and just hangs loose through the spark plug access hole. So we're going to get a reasonable distance so that the hose could stick far enough up and out of here. I'm going to cut the hose right here. And what we're going to do is put our fuel inlet port from the remote tank on here so that whenever you're running it off the stock tank, you simply fold this up and tuck it in here and put the cover back over the spark plug hole. Or to use the remote tank, you would undo this. It's attached with a tether cord. Reach in here and pull out your port. So let's go ahead and make up our port. Included in the kit are quick disconnect fittings, and these are Yamaha style quick disconnect fittings. They are not Mercury. The Mercury is just a couple thousandths of an inch shorter, and if you mix and match and use Mercury and Yamaha, it won't work right. So what we're going to do is take the roll of Teflon tape also included in the kit and wrap the Teflon tape around the threads of the fuel port. Be very careful when you're doing this. Do not overlap the end of the thread as in like this. If you do that, it will go together, but it'll shear off that little piece, and that little piece of Teflon tape, it's going to get lodged wherever it can do the most damage. That's how my luck works. Then go ahead and screw the pulse port, or excuse me, the hose barb onto the fuel port. Tighten this down. Then what we're going to do is feed this into this hose. Put a little bit of oil on it. And then we'll go ahead and put another hose clamp here. Like I said, this will then be tucked in here for storage purposes when you're running it off the stock tank. So now we go ahead and gather up some tools, get them out of the way. The last step is going to be to put the covers in place. The covers are pretty straightforward and simple. There are 3 tabs at the bottom that you put in, and then you press in to where these snaps engage. And then you put the screws in place. And remember, there are 2 screws on each side. Remember, your fuel inlet port is tucked right in here. So whenever you're running it off the remote tank, you simply leave this hanging loose. If you wish, you could cut a slight notch in this to where you would slide this cover back in place and this hose would hang out and you'd hook the prime bulb hose to it. I see no reason to bother with the notch on this. It does no harm at all, hanging loose like this. But if you like a nicer, cleaner look, then just put a notch right here that goes around the hose. The kit comes with an instruction decal. I would like to put the instruction decal right here so you can see what the instructions are. If you're the only one using the generator, then there's no real need to put the instructions on it because you'll remember. But if there are a whole bunch of people who will be using the generator, this way there are printed instructions that they can clearly see. And now we'll put the cover on the other side. And this side cover works the same way. You got the 3 snaps, or the 3 tabs at the bottom, and then the snaps. You got the 2 screws that go into the top, just like on the other side. And then the fuel selector valve. Or the fuel selector valve knob. So now that we got the cabinet back in place, the only thing left to do is roll it outside and test run it. Again, if you're watching this video on YouTube, if you look in the description section below, you'll see that there's a link to my website. The page for this product on my website has answers to just about any question you could possibly have. If you do not see the answer there, do not hesitate to contact me either by email or phone. Please do not leave any questions on YouTube because I just don't monitor the YouTube comments section. So if you leave a question on there, it'll be a long time before I even see it and answer it. If you've got any relevant comments that don't require a response from me, then I urge you to go ahead and leave them. I thank you for your time.